My name is Michelle Gibson, and I'm doing this video on demonstrating how I would explain trauma. And I'm going to act as if I'm explaining it to really just the general public about trauma. And the reason that I am choosing to focus on that is because of the area that I live in there's sort of this widespread denial that trauma exists in our county, and that there aren't really symptoms or problems that come along with that. And anybody who claims that they have been impacted by trauma are really just people who are trying to make an excuse for maybe bad behavior. So it's pretty relevant for me to practice this because it's probably something I'm going to be doing a significant amount in my career in this county. And I would start with really defining kind of my idea of trauma in layman terms. And, what I would say is trauma is a negative experience or event that takes place in which a person is harmed in some way, physically, emotionally, mentally, or sexually. And often that experience or that event is one in which the victim cannot get away. They're unable to protect themselves, or maybe they try to protect themselves, but it's ineffective. They're not able to. So really they're trapped in some way where they cannot escape the person who's harming them or the situation in which they're being harmed. And when a person experiences a situation like this, there's significant impact on the brain. And one of the ways that helps me kind of understand trauma is to think of it as if it's a mental injury. We're all pretty familiar with the idea of an injury. We've all had some sort of injury at some point. And really, trauma can be understood as just a mental injury. And it's going to look differently depending on all sorts of different things. An elderly person is going to experience trauma differently than a child will. And men are going to experience trauma differently than women do. The type of trauma is going to have a different impact. You're not going to see the same types of trauma have the same impact. There's also going to be a difference depending on the relationship the victim has with the perpetrator. Is it somebody that they've known their entire lives? Is it a parent? Somebody who's supposed to be protecting them? Or was it somebody that they'd never seen before? Was it a person who was raped and they'd never seen the rapist before? Both of those scenarios are going to have a different impact on how a person experiences trauma. And to be clear, I'm not saying that one type of trauma or one situation is better than the other or worse than the other. All I'm saying is that there's different impacts depending on many different variables, and so no trauma looks exactly the same. As with any injury, healing from trauma takes a significant amount of time, and we're not going to see people just bounce back from that immediately after it happens. Again, with most injuries, there's a period of limitations or an inability to function as they did prior to the injury. So maybe it's helpful to have an example. If you think of a person with a broken leg, their life is going to be impacted by that broken leg for some time, and they're going to have to learn how to do things differently for a while. Even from the time that they leave from getting their cast on, they're going to have to figure out how to get into a car, and that's going to look different than it did before they had a broken leg. How are they going to go upstairs? Or how are they going to go downstairs? How are they going to walk? Most likely they're going to have crutches, and they're going to have to learn how to walk with those crutches. They're going to have to figure out how to carry things. How do they sleep now that they have this cast on their leg? What about getting dressed? What about taking showers? All of those things are going to be impacted by this injury. And there's some similarities with that concept with a mental injury or with trauma, in that a person's life is impacted in every aspect by that injury. It's not as visible as maybe a cast is, and obviously we can't put a cast on this trauma, but the injury is still there. And it's going to impact a person's life, not only on the small scale, not only on the day-to-day things, but also on the broader picture of functioning in school or functioning in work and trying to maintain adult lives. So we're definitely going to see that. Just lost my, okay. And with a broken leg, you've got a change in appearance. You've got this cast on the person's leg, but with trauma, maybe you don't have a change of appearance, but the person who has been traumatized has a changed view of themselves and of the world, and that's going to be pretty significant. And they're going to kind of see the world now through this trauma lens, especially initially, and probably to some extent for the rest of their lives. Hopefully that will grow and change a little bit from what it initially looks like, but it does have oftentimes lifelong impact, because trauma changes a person, and there's many different injuries that we know that change people. So it's not hard to see how a mental injury could also change a person. And the process for healing for any injuries is long and complicated, but especially for trauma. But the key is that healing is possible, but it takes a lot of work, and it's very difficult. The individual who was traumatized often develops a new sense that either they are not going to be protected by a caregiver, or maybe in a case of domestic violence, they're not going to be protected by their loved one. Their loved one is the one that's harming them. So they either learn that they're not going to be protected, or that they're incapable of protecting themselves. And in either case, that's going to result in a heightened sense of danger and a lowered sense or a decreased sense of ability to protect oneself. And that's probably why we see people who have a history of trauma, they tend to overreact more quickly, because they do have this heightened sense of danger, and they have this lowered sense of ability to protect themselves. So they're gonna panic more easily than somebody who feels like they could protect themselves would. And if you really think about it, if you look at humanity, the history of humanity, we are born with a desire to fight, with a desire to survive and to succeed. And a huge part of that is the ability to protect oneself, or to at least fight back if one's attacked. And what happens when that's taken away from us? What happens when we are told, or when we believe, because of an experience, that we are not able to fight back, that we are not able to survive? That's going to have a really huge impact on our very core, because that is a core element of being human, is the ability to survive. And if that's taken away, that's going to have a really powerful impact on a person. And this heightened sense of danger and lowered sense of ability to protect oneself is going to change everything about how a person functions. Kind of like we talked about with the broken leg and the day-to-day things. You're going to have things like interacting with the cashier at the grocery store. For somebody who maybe was attacked in a grocery store, that's going to impact that. Maybe driving to work for somebody who was in a terrible car accident, and it was very traumatic for them. Driving to work or driving anywhere, if they're even able to get in a car, is going to be a pretty big deal for them. What about a person who enters a crowded room? That might no longer be possible for them. They might just go into a panic because of people in the room based on their trauma experience. And those are just three very small examples. Their examples are countless. But it needs to be clear too that healing is possible, and that part of the process of healing from trauma is learning to reconnect one's body with one's mind/soul, And what we see in trauma is this learned ability to, especially in cases where one is, there's a long duration of time in which one is traumatized, they learn to disassociate, which just basically means that their mind goes elsewhere, and so that their mind isn't being exposed to what their body is experiencing. And it's really a brilliant coping mechanism because it allows them to survive the trauma, but it really creates problems later in life. And the process of connecting one's body with one's mind, which I know sounds a little bit strange, is really what allows a person to heal. And there's a lot of methods out there to help patients or help people who have experienced trauma to heal from that. It's hard work, as we talked about, but we actually do a lot of damage by not recognizing that people who have had these really negative experiences are going to be impacted by that. So it helps to acknowledge that, and it helps to recognize that they're going to live life a little bit differently, and that's okay, and that there's healing and that there's hope.